In August of 2020, we learned that our precious baby no longer had a heartbeat, and it was a time that I prayed to Jesus for a miracle. If he could do anything, then I knew that he could resurrect that child, and a miscarriage did not have to be the reality. I hemorrhaged from that miscarriage as well and ended up needing 2 blood transfusions and an emergency surgery, so there was a lot of trauma besides just the miscarriage that happened from that. And it was a time that I really had to preach to myself something that didn't feel true at the time, which is that God was good and he wanted good things for me. During that miscarriage, I was praying to see God's hand in that, for that to be a story that would glorify him. And instead, I just got him. So then we got pregnant with Atlee. And then about 7 days after birth, my bleeding really picked up again. We went to the ER on a Friday night. My blood pressure was very low. The next morning at around 10 a.m., things took a turn again, and I started bleeding even more significantly. My blood pressure severely dropped, and we had to call an ambulance. It was then that I kind of really started to figure out how much worse this probably was than the first time. We had a very thankfully seasoned EMT team there at WakeMed Cary, but I remember them specifically turning to Eric and saying, "We see a lot of things. This is significant." And so I was rushed back for an emergency D&C. All the while they were giving me blood, I think, throughout that process. I gave my prayer, I submitted, and I said amen. And this was just kind of just a crying out, like what you see in Psalms of like, let me see my daughters again. Jesus, let me live, because I really did not think that I was going to. So when I went in for the surgery, I don't really remember anything after that until I woke up again, which was much later. But the events that transpired through that was I went into the surgery, they did the D&C, and the bleeding would not stop. They told Eric, they went out to him and they said, "We have 15 minutes, and if the bleeding does not stop, we are going to have to do an emergency hysterectomy." I guess Eric told Beth and Christina, who were at my house taking care of the girls, what was happening, and they told me that they both just went to opposite ends of the house and just started texting, calling, praying, and starting that big prayer chain. I mean, there were a few people who were already praying at that time, but there are people praying that I didn't even know. And within 15 minutes, they said, "Okay, she's stable enough. We're going to transport her to Big Wake." One of my friends actually worked at Big Wake, and so when I asked him for feedback on what happened, because I don't remember, he said that they lost my blood pressure and my pulse. And Eric had no idea who was sitting in the front seat and didn't know. And they were almost having to do CPR. So we arrived at Big Wake, and they had the ICU doctor come down and put an IV directly into my leg, and I got 5 units of blood in the span of about 10 minutes. In all total from that day, I ended up having 10 blood transfusions and 4 PPE, which our body holds 10 units of blood. They put a balloon in to stop the bleeding, and if that didn't help, then I was going to have an embolism. And the balloon worked. It was able to stop the bleeding, and I was in ICU for a little bit, and I just remember being on the gurney and being pushed back and looking at every single person, kind of like a movie, like the bright shining lights looking at me and asking them, "Am I going to die?" During that time, there were people holding my hands up, like Aaron and Hur did to Moses, of just pleading and interceding on my behalf for my life. So within the span of about 3 or 4 hours, my entire body's worth of blood had been replaced. I honestly didn't understand how serious this was until after the fact. I had EMTs coming to visit me in ICU just to see if I'd made it. We had doctors and nurses from WakeMed Cary calling and friending Eric on Facebook, just saying that they had been praying for me. And I think that really showed me the gravity of what was happening, because for nurses and doctors who see this every day to follow up and check and make sure that you're alive and say that they were praying for you was a big deal. My heart sighs relief into worshiping a God that is too big to understand. He was there when I honestly wasn't sure that I wanted him to be there. He was there in the loneliness and the brokenness and the grief. I want to tie this story up in a really cute bow and tell you that I don't have any questions anymore, and that this is all really easy for me, but that would not be true. I'm just continually coming back to God with my questions because he's big enough for them. And having Atlee doesn't erase the pain of the miscarriage. And being here today and living through such a miracle, honestly, doesn't mean that I still don't doubt. Prayer is a lot less about getting the outcome that you pray for and a lot more about just trusting the Father and his sovereignty with what you bring before him. Throughout this process, I have really learned what it looks like and what it means to cry out to God and the power of communal prayer. Now I'm so much quicker to drop everything and pray because I know that Jesus hears me. We don't know why our baby, Isaiah James is what we chose to name him. Isaiah meaning God's strength, and James meaning God will protect. Why we didn't get to meet him here on earth. But we are so thankful for his short life that we'll get to experience eternity with Jesus. I just submit to the sovereignty of the Lord over life and death, because if he were small enough to be put in a box, then he would not be big enough to be worshiped. And he is so worthy of my worship.